Good morning. Good to see everybody. Glad you're here. If you're visiting with us, or if you just want to know more about Lifeway, there's a connection card in the back of the chairs there. We'd love for you to fill one of those out. Let us know what's on your mind, and you can drop it in the offering buckets as they pass, or there's a information table as you exit this room on your right. There's a little box there. Drop it in the box, and we'd love to know what you're thinking. We'll be able to, we'll look at those things, and we'll get back to you accordingly. And again, we're just glad you're here this morning. Just a few things I want to let you know about or remind you of this morning is, first of all, our chili cook-off is today, and we have, that's going to be tonight at 6:30, and we just want to encourage you and to come to cook your favorite chilies or soups. It's going to be a great time of fellowship. One of the things would be a great way to wrap up this week. It's been a busy week. It's been a great week. A lot of things have happened. Had the renovations going on in Kids Life this week. We had the 5K, just a lot of things. And so this is going to be a great way just to finish up the week, to celebrate all that's happened, to celebrate what God has done, and then just to celebrate our friendship and our fellowship together. And so we're going to invite you to bring your favorite soup, your favorite chili. You can bring cornbread. You can bring whatever kind of toppings you like to go on it. Bring some desserts. We have the plates and cups, the drinks. We have those things covered. So we just want to invite you to come tonight. But also along with that, we're supporting the Palmetto's Women's Center, and they are needing like wipes and diapers. And this is a way that we can also support a local organization who's out there helping others, helping these young mothers and families in situations where they just need a little help. They need, and we've talked about that over the last couple of weeks. So this is a great way to do several things with the fellowship and support this organization as well. So I want to invite you to that. Also, just on that note, afterwards, may need a little help getting some things set up. So if you guys want to hang around for a few minutes after the service today, help us get some tables and chairs set up, that would be great as well. We want to get the lobby and everything in place so that this afternoon won't be quite as much work getting that in place. So if you can do that, you can see me or catch Mark, and we'll point you in the right direction of getting that set up. The other thing I want to remind you about is coming up is the York County Extreme Easter Egg Experience, and that's going to be April 6th at the York Middle School. It's a growing event, and we're excited from the standpoint of we've got so many community organizations that are pitching in, other churches coming together with this. So we're excited about that. We want to make sure you keep that on your calendar as well. I think that's it this morning, and we are so glad that you're here, and we're going to get started.
Welcome to Lifeway. We are so glad you're here. It has been a crazy week and a crazy weekend. We have been going here at Lifeway. Lots of cool things happening. Alvin will talk about it a bit. But we want to take this time to totally focus our hearts and our minds on God. So we want to invite you to stand with us and let's lift our voices to Him this morning. Here we go.
Found in
You can be seated.
In just a few moments, our usher's going to come forward. But as I was thinking about this week, as we think about a time of giving, and we think about how God just orchestrates things. I look back at this week and I look at how busy it's really been, and usually we don't plan so many things going on at one time because we know how taxing it is, especially with the renovation and with the 5K and then having an event tonight. But one of the things that that it shows is how when we're focused on what God wants us to do and God's mission, how the body comes together. And as I was thinking about that this week, I was thinking about what Paul says, and he's speaking in Romans, and he says, just as each of us has one body with many members, and these members not all have the same function. So in Christ, we who are many form one body, and each member belongs to all the others. And that was so evident this week. And a lot of times we see these events and we look at these events and we just say, yeah, all this came together, and we encourage one another and we thank one another for that. But sometimes we overlook the fact that God, in his orchestration of what he designed the church to be, is that we all have gifts and talents. He's given us all certain things that we can do better than others. And it doesn't mean that one is less significant than the other, but it means that when you come together with this gift and this talent, and you come together with this gift and this talent, and it all comes together in one well-orchestrated body. And I just want to say thank you for being that this week, and being that each and every week, because that's what it takes for the body of Christ, for the church to represent our community. And when the community sees that taking place, they're going to say, hey, there's something different. Because so many times we don't operate that way as a church. We make it individualized. We make it individualistic. But it's not that way, and that's not what God designed. And I just want to say this week was just, to me, a picture of God's design coming together as each did their own part. From organization to and teamwork with the 5K, from organization and teamwork to a reconstruction job, from organization coming together to a great end of the week with things that are going on for tonight with the chili cook-off. And it all seems so simple. But I just want to say thank you for being obedient to God. And as you, our ushers come forward, we have an opportunity to continue in being that one body, to continue to grow in what God has called us to do here at Lifeway in this community. I'm going to pray, and our ushers are going to come forward. We're going to continue. Father, I thank you for each and every person who is here in this church. And God, there's maybe others who are out sick or other things going on, but God, they're part of this body, and I just want to say thank you for them. God, thank you for the people being obedient. Thank you for a servant heart. Thank you for people being willing to give out of their love for you. Thank you for demonstrating that through your love for us, through sending Jesus Christ, and for Jesus who willingly gave up himself so that we have eternal life. So God, as we continue this morning to lift up your name and to give you praise, and to give you honor, and to give you glory, we just thank you for the grace and the mercy that you've put down and you've given to us. So God, we just want to say thank you. Thank you, thank you. In your name we pray. Amen.
So we are in this new series that we're in. We're going to jump into in just a bit. But one of the amazing things about this series is it's a transition from an old way of thinking to a new way of thinking that Jesus instituted and instigated and brought onto the scene whenever he showed up on this planet. And the amazing thing about it is that what God has offered to us through Jesus is the same thing that he's been offering all along. We just didn't see it. The people of Israel didn't get it. And when Jesus comes on the scene, he shows it, and then Paul comes along and talks about it. He explains that this is not something that you can do. This is not something you can do to be right with God. This is not something that you can do to work yourself into a relationship with God. It all comes down to this new thing called grace. It's an Old Testament thing that has been brought over into a very beautiful way through the death and resurrection of Jesus for our sin. And one of the things we're going to talk about this morning is the fact that many people would like to hold on to the old way of doing things, checking list of do's and don'ts, trying to find the right things that qualify them to be in a right relationship with God. But you can't have that in grace too. In fact, the Apostle Paul says this in the book of Romans chapter 11. He says, "But if it is by grace, it is no longer on the basis of works. Otherwise, grace would no longer be grace." And that's what we're going to talk about this morning. We're going to stand together. Let's sing this song, Grace to Grace, together.
Joy
grace through Jesus. God, we are so undeserving. Nothing we could do would ever merit your favor. And yet, God, you bestow it upon us, and we are so grateful. God, this morning, speak to us. Give us fresh minds, fresh eyes to see things in a fresh way. And we ask this in the precious, wonderful name of Jesus. Amen. You can be seated. So one thing I do want to bring to your attention that we did not mention earlier, and that is we have, it is time to recommend our elders for the upcoming year. And so this morning as you leave, if you are a partner with Lifeway, as you go out the door, there is a brochure that explains to you the biblical role of elders as well as our expectations of elders. You'll find that in a pamphlet. You'll also find a card there for you to recommend 4 men to serve in this capacity. And a couple of things people ask us about that. First of all, they'll say, well, how do I know who are eligible to be elders? What men are eligible? And here is one of our approaches to that. We believe that you should look to men that you believe model the role of elder already, and that you should approach them and find out from them if they are eligible, because many times men won't step up to the challenge and they won't become a partner. And it requires 2 years of partnership here at Lifeway to be an elder. And they're not willing or haven't been willing to do that. And so it's a challenge to them. You're holding them accountable to that. So we invite you to talk to those men that you believe are eligible for that role and invite them to make sure that they are fulfilling those things already in terms of their requirements, that they're there. And then you can use that card to record their names. Again, you have up to 4 names. I believe there's 1 or possibly 2 cards in each pamphlet. If your family has more, remember our partners begin at the age of 12 and up. And so if you're a student, you're 12 and up, you're welcome to take a card to recommend. And then those cards will go to our elders, and our elders will have a conversation with those men. We'll actually have a dinner where we'll introduce them to the elder discipleship process, and they will go through a 4 to 6 month discipleship process where we take them through everything from how to study Scripture properly to leadership principles and biblical principles for leadership. And they'll do that process, after which they will be interviewed, and they'll go basically through an entire vetting process at that point before they're affirmed. We have 3 gentlemen that we will be presenting to you shortly for elder, and then we will take these men through a process, and we'll begin adding more men to the role. So that will be available for you on your way out the door. If you need more recommendation cards, they are there on the information table in the lobby. Alvin has already mentioned all the amazing things that God has done for you guys this past week. If you haven't seen or haven't heard, I will tell you that the 5K that we did yesterday raised over $8,500. We don't know the exact amount. Yeah, that's amazing. And we are so grateful to be able to do that in memory of Will and all that he meant to our children and our students, and his heart for children and students. And we look forward to how God is going to implement those resources in the lives of children and students in the upcoming year. We have some exciting things we'll talk about in the weeks and months ahead regarding that. So that's a really cool thing. And then who knew that you could do a building renovation in 1 week? But we pulled that off. Don't ask me exactly how, except amazing people that jumped in last Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and then about a half a day or so yesterday. I couldn't begin possibly to name everyone involved with that, but it's incredible. If you haven't seen, Once Kids Life is empty today, but they will not let you over, security will not let you over there if you do not have a child, but you can go over and you can see the new carpet, you can see the walls that have come down, the space that has been opened up. So, pretty incredible thing. So, again, thank you all for all that you did with that. So we are in our second. Yeah, you guys, I'm good with that. Go ahead. Yeah. Good. If you keep doing that, I'm going to start expecting it when I walk out. All right. So we are in our second installment in our brand new series, and that's actually the title, Brand New. And the reason we called it Brand New is because when Jesus arrived on the scene, he came to institute and initiate something that was literally brand new. And when he comes on the scene and you look at what he brought, you realize this is not a religion 2.0. This is not some old system that he's simply updating and upgrading and adding new software or hardware to. It's not a revision of Judaism. Jesus shows up and he gives us something that's entirely different. And so we felt like the series Brand New was a great title for this. And I want to give you a little review this morning. I'll be very honest. This is going to seem very academic early on. And maybe you were here last week. In fact, some of you were here and you said, I wasn't quite sure where you were going, but you kind of brought it around. When you brought it around, man, it just all made sense. And that's really cool because as we move and progress through this series and we bring it full circle, you're going to see how much this really does apply to your life and to the church and how we are supposed to be the church, the New Testament church that we're called to be. And so let me give you just a little review. We said that when Jesus showed up, it was a signal to the end of the temple model. And I told you a little bit about the temple model. It's going to be here on the screen so you can see what it looks like. But the temple model we talked a lot about last week wasn't something that was just associated with the temple, the Jewish temple. The temple model was an entire approach to religion, ancient religion, and it's been brought into our current culture and generation as well. It goes all the way back to Egyptian religion, Assyrian religion. It goes all the way back to Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks, and of course the Jewish religion itself. And the temple model looks like this, and you'll still find the system today, but it always starts with a sacred place. The temple model has a sacred place. There's always a sacred place where you go, and it's like, shh, be quiet. It's a holy place. It's holy. Don't set your cup there. It's a holy place. That's actually something that just happened recently. Somebody told me about. You can't set your cup on that table. That's the holy table. So don't do that. Take your hat. Get your hat off in the building. It's holy. All right? Don't run. Don't run. It's a holy place. Okay, now how many of you, that reminds you of your childhood? Okay? You don't have to put your hands up. But that's kind of where we come from. It's sort of where we've been. So there's this sacred place where some sort of religious ceremony occurs, and so there's just something holy about that. And every sacred place has a sacred text. There's always some text. It's an inscription, it's an oracle, it's tablets, it's plates. It's always something written down, and the sacred text is kept in the sacred place. And then in the temple model, there's always sacred men, and with the exception of a few of the religions that had goddesses that they worshiped where women were used, the majority, if not more than the majority of them, always have just sacred men. Sacred men, and those sacred men have possession and they handle the sacred text. And as they handle the sacred text, they tell the sincere followers, and we could actually call them superstitious followers because they always feel like something is being hidden from them, kept from them. They're not really sure where they stand in all of it. But we're going to call them sincere followers. We'll give the benefit of the doubt. The sacred men tell the sincere followers, this is how you're supposed to live your life. And if you don't behave this way, God is going to come and He's going to get you. And the reason that I know God is going to get you is because I'm a sacred man and I handle the sacred text here in the sacred place where I make sure everything goes the way it's supposed to. So the sincere, superstitious people live in fear and they live without hope. They have no hope in anything. And so the temple model is very much alive and well throughout the world, but it's also prevalent in a lot of our culture today. And for some of you who've grown up in the Christian church, you would say, that sounds a whole lot like what I'm used to. That sounds a lot like what I grew up in. In fact, because your church was a lot like that, where you were, when you were old enough, you just walked away and you decided, I'm not going back. And it's been hard for you to come back to church and come back to Christians and being around this stuff. That was what caused you to resist church all those years. But as we talked about last week, and we'll hit this quickly, when Jesus came on the scene, he does inaugurate and initiate and launch something that is really completely brand new. And what Jesus started was a total departure from the temple model. It was nothing like the temple model. Jesus didn't take connecting to God away from the Jewish temple model. He removed God from the entire temple model altogether. He just removed it. Jesus established what he called a brand new covenant. A new covenant. If you were here last week, we talked about that. It was a covenant that was in his blood. And then Jesus created this new ethic, and this new ethic comes by way of establishing a brand new command, which we talked a bit about. We're going to talk a lot about that in the next couple of weeks. And Jesus said this brand new command takes precedent over all the other commands. He said, if you get this one command right, then all of the other commands, you don't have to worry about them. They're all part of this. And that idea may be hard for some of us because we look at this book and go, but what about all this other stuff written in here? Well, if you remember, right after Jesus comes on the scene, there's a Jewish leader who comes to Jesus and says, what's the most important command? And Jesus says, love God and love others. All the other laws are summed up in those two things. And the Jewish leader agreed with that. So he said, all the other things in here are summed up with love God and love others. Well, what Jesus does with this new command is he simplifies it even more, and he still says it's all summed up. Everything in here is summed up in this one command, this new command that I give to you. And so it's a completely new thing. It's a brand new covenant. It's a brand new command. And then Jesus also says he institutes this new movement. And this new movement he tells us about at Caesarea Philippi. We talked a bit about it last week. Jesus said to his disciples, I'm going to build a new congregation, okay, an ecclesia. And unfortunately, when the scriptures were translated, there was really only one man at the time who would stand up for this word, ecclesia, a congregation. And he ended up being burned at the stake. And then they went and took a German word, the word that we get for church, and they forced it into the text. And now when we see this, Jesus says to his disciples and to Peter, upon this statement that I'm the Christ, which is what Peter said, I will build my church. But it really should be ecclesia. It should be the congregation. I'm going to build a gathering of people around me and around this movement or around this new commandment, this new covenant I'm establishing. And it's going to be a brand new movement. So this brand new movement that Jesus started begins with a gathering of people. It's not a revision. It's not a rewrite. It's not a new version. It is a brand new thing. Brand new thing. The old way, the temple model, it was built around sacred places and sacred texts and sacred men, and it was built around a standard that only the elite could live up to, and that would be the sacred men themselves, and that they were not shy of telling you that they could measure up to it, but you could not. And Jesus came along and he raised the bar, he raised the standard so that no one, not even the elite, could meet the requirements, could meet the standard. So he levels the playing field, and then Jesus offered himself as the sacrifice for all people so that we all have access to be a part of the movement. We can all get in on the new covenant and live out the new command. So he levels the playing field for us. The temple model required that you come to a sacred place and you make peace with God. And Jesus said, forget that. From now on, I want you to go and make peace with your neighbor. Because how you are with your neighbor is the measure of how you are with God. You go and make peace with the person that has something against you, or you go and make peace with the person that you have something against. And the temple model was all about a nation, a people. Jesus came along and says, this is not about geography. This is for all peoples, all nations, all tribes, all tongues. It's for everyone. This isn't about sacred places. It's not about sacred people. It's not about sacred text or sacred men. He says, you now are going to be the sacred. You are the temple of God. Every one of us are the temple of God. So you see, all of this was brand new. And in ancient religions, everyone was religious. The people of that day, they were so superstitious and so unsure, and they had heard so many things. They're all very religious. And so when Jesus comes on the scene after the resurrection, the Gentiles begin to flock to this new, brand new thing because their paganism had never worked for them. But the first followers of this brand new movement, they were Jewish. And as many of you know, Jewish people flocked to Jesus because the sacred men were constantly reminding them of how bad they were and how they didn't measure up, and there was no hope, and they would never find peace with God. And so the Jewish people heard Jesus' message, and they thought, well, finally, at least there's hope. So many of the Jewish people began to follow, and while they followed, internally they had this conflict. They had this tension. And it was, how do we abandon the old way? How do we abandon Judaism and embrace this new Jesus movement? Because it didn't feel right to give up the customs and the traditions that they had been raised with. It didn't feel right to walk away from everything they had known throughout all those years, because old ways, old traditions die hard. It almost felt sacrilegious to them to abandon the old ways, the Old Testament, even though Jesus said He was the fulfillment of it. And what that revealed, and we're going to talk about this next week as we break down our new commandment. But what we learn in all of that is that our consciences determine religious realities, whether they reflect reality or not. Our consciences determine religious realities, whether they reflect it or not. And here's what I mean. You believe something. And you believe it with all your heart. You've heard it. You've been raised in it. You believe, but then you put it to the test. And it doesn't pay off. And it doesn't pan out. And logic says you need to abandon what you've believed. But your conscience won't allow you to do that, because your conscience is what causes you to hold on to it. And you just can't let it go. And this plays out in our ethics and our morality all the time. I grew up Baptist. Actually, I grew up being taken to a Baptist church. I wouldn't say I grew up Baptist, but I was taken to a Baptist church. And when I got to college, I made friends with Catholics. I had several friends that came from a Catholic background. I went to a Baptist school, but they had these people who were coming to play sports, especially soccer, who came from Catholicism. And they show up, and I would meet them and get to know them, and they would say, hey, we're going to confession. Do you want to go? And I'm going, confession? Why do you go to confession? You don't have to go to confession. Just tell God you're sorry. You don't have to go anywhere. And they're going, no, we got to go. We got to go to confession. We have to go. And it was because their conscience was determining their religious realities. Or as Baptists, they would often, I would say, I don't drink alcohol. And my Catholic friends would go, none? And I'm like, no, Baptists don't drink. And they're going, really? They don't drink? And I said, well, they do drink. They just act like they don't drink, so nobody will know that they drink. Okay? So, but no, we don't drink alcohol. And my Catholic friends were like, we drink alcohol in church. And I'm going, what? That's crazy. Why? How do you do that? But they were raised with their religion. I was raised with bringing my religion. And those things, they fine-tune our conscience. They give us a base from which we operate. And we're going to cover that over the next couple of weeks. But here's the problem. Whenever I start talking to you next week about these new things that we're really going to dive into, you're going to struggle, because your conscience is so fine-tuned with what you've heard and what you've learned and what you were brought up in. And a lot of it comes out of the temple model, and you don't even realize it. And Jesus shows up and he goes, no, this is completely different. So when the first Jewish Christians were struggling with all of this and trying to follow Jesus but still stuck to the old way, that's understandable. They were attempting to assimilate the new Jesus model into the old temple model. After all, He was the Messiah. He's the extension of the Old Testament. He's the fulfillment of the law. He even says that. So they hung on to their old ways, and they merged and blended Jesus and His teachings into the temple methods. Fortunately, the Apostle Paul comes on the scene. And when he comes on the scene, he comes to the church's rescue. And excuse me, we're going to get to the scripture in a minute. Galatians 5 is where we're going to be. Galatians 5. But Paul comes on the scene, and you need to remember where he's coming from. Paul is really Saul of Tarsus. He wasn't a Christian when he started. In fact, he was one of those sacred men that was part of the temple model. He was not just a sacred man, he was a Pharisee. And he claimed to be the best Pharisee who could out-Pharisee all the other Pharisees. He said he was better than the rest. He had pretty much memorized the Torah. He taught Old Testament law. So he's well versed in the old way. And when he found out about Christianity, he basically said to God, look, God, I got this. And he goes after Christians. And he tried single-handedly to wipe out Christianity. And he was doing a good job until finally God got his attention. And Saul of Tarsus became a Jesus follower. And he joined the Jesus movement. And if anyone understood how this was a brand new movement, and it was a complete departure from Judaism, it was Paul. And that's what he taught. He said, this isn't an add-on. This is not in addition to. This is something completely, entirely new. And the Apostle Paul knew how dangerous it would be to try and import and mix the two things together. So on Paul's first missionary journey, he took quite a few journeys, but his first missionary journey, Paul goes out and he starts these ecclesias, and he goes to this first journey, he goes to Galatia. And in Galatia, he starts this ecclesia. Galatia is a Roman province in modern-day Turkey. And Paul goes to the Jewish synagogue, and he begins to teach about Jesus. And there are Jewish people there, and they embrace Jesus. And Gentile peoples hear Paul's message about Jesus, and they embrace Jesus. And they form this ecclesia, this gathering, this congregation. They come around this common thing in Jesus, and they begin this movement. Paul is part of initiating this movement. And so Paul then leaves to go start more ecclesias as part of the movement. And behind him comes another group of missionaries. And they are Jewish Christians. And they tell the new Christians in Galatia, they go, look, hey, Paul didn't give you the whole message. He left some parts out. If you're going to become a Jesus follower, you need to become a Jew first. You got to become Jewish because, after all, Jesus is Jewish, and he's the Messiah. He's an extension of the Old Testament. He even said he was a fulfillment of the Old Testament. So it only makes sense that if you're going to follow Jesus, you need to be a Jew first. Now, next week, I'm going to talk about some of the specific ways that the temple model has invaded our version of Christianity. So I don't want you to miss next week, but what I want you to see for these next few minutes in this text is how dangerous that is. And Paul gets how dangerous that is. Paul is just angry because of what they're trying to do. And I'm going to do my best to illustrate the extraordinary emotion and anger that Paul has toward all this. Paul is going to talk about a group of people called Judaizers. And Judaizers, that's a New Testament term for Jewish Christians who believed that Gentiles had to convert to Judaism in order to follow Jesus. So these Judaizers are Christians, but because their conscience would not allow them to let go of the old ways, they're trying to bring the old ways into the new ways and mesh those things together. So you got to become Jewish first, and that was really hard for a Gentile to do. And for a Gentile male, it required a little bit of surgery, a little snip, snip, okay? So that wasn't necessarily a cool thing either. So when Paul discovers what's transpired after he left Galatia, that these Judaizers have been telling these new Christians, you've got to blend Judaism with Jesus, he became apoplectic. Apoplectic. Now, that's a fun word, right? We don't use that word. But apoplectic means a lot like it sounds. Right there in the middle, pop. That's what Paul was about to do. He was about to pop. He was mad. He wanted to pop somebody. He was mad over this. He had incredible anger. So the Apostle Paul knows that this is a big deal, and all these people are going, it's not a big deal. It's just a little Old Testament. We're going to mix it with Jesus. It'll be just fine. And Paul goes, no, it is a big deal. You don't understand what's at stake. You don't understand what you're risking, because what Jesus started is completely new. And if you try and you blend the old way and you blend the new way, well, you're diluting and polluting the new way. So we're going to walk through Galatians 5 verse by verse very quickly. We're going to look at some of the ways in which Paul expresses his anger, his hostility, his intensity, and I hope you can feel that. But all of this carries over as we move into next week, because this is how seriously we should take not bringing the old way into the new way and just doing what Jesus said we're supposed to do. So the Apostle Paul, he gets all apoplectic, and he says it's a huge deal. And we're going to pick up Galatians 5, verse 1, and here's what he says. For freedom, Christ has set us free. I love that word free there, because it's not free like you and I think about. We think freedom is letting go, but this actually is the word exempt. You are now exempt from the law. You're exempt. You're not held to it. You're not bound to it. For freedom, Christ has set us free. Stand firm, therefore, and do not submit again to a yoke of slavery. So he sees the old way as slavery. He sees the old way as holding us back, as keeping us in bondage. Look, I, Paul, say to you, and some translations actually say, mark my words, I, Paul, say to you, and it uses exclamation points. And I think that's so clear of what Paul is trying to communicate. He says that if you accept circumcision, now before I go on, let me tell you, Paul is not against the process or the procedure of circumcision. In fact, Paul was Jewish. He was circumcised. All of Jesus' first followers were circumcised. Many of you have been circumcised. In fact, if you've been circumcised, I'm just kidding, I'm not going to make you do that. Okay, circumcision in and of itself is not the problem. That's not what Paul is dealing with. Circumcision in this context represents the old covenant. It was the covenant that God established with Abraham to make him and his people, make Abraham and his descendants the people of God. So that was the old covenant. But we learned last week, Jesus launched what kind of covenant? A brand new covenant, right? Jesus launches this brand new covenant. So Paul's like, wait. If you allow yourself to be circumcised, you're embracing the old covenant. You don't need to be circumcised. That was a sign for the people of Israel, that they belong exclusively to God and uniquely to God. That's a different covenant. You're not under that covenant. You're under a brand new covenant. And if you're circumcised, then he says, Christ will be of no advantage to you. In other words, you have abandoned the new and you have embraced the old. So now the new is no good to you. He goes on, he says, I testify again to every man who accepts circumcision that he is obligated to keep the whole law. Now, this is where the big deal comes in, okay? Because what they're trying to do is just blend some of the old with the new. We're just going to blend a little bit with the new. We'll follow some of the old temple ways. You know, we won't do all the dietary things. You know, maybe just selfish. We won't have selfish. We'll eat the other stuff, okay? But we're not going to do that. And Paul's like, this is a big deal because if you're going to be circumcised and put yourself under the old covenant, you've got to put yourself under all the law, the whole thing. You've got to eat the right things and dress the right way and walk the right way, and you've got to observe the Sabbath. You've got to do all of it. You've got to keep all the law. You're either all in or you're not in at all. And Paul said, God has launched something for all nations that's brand new. It's completely different, and circumcision has no value. It has no value. It doesn't relate to the new covenant. It doesn't relate to the new way. That was all for the old covenant. You get to be in a special relationship with God without that. He says, for you have severed from Christ, you who would be justified by the law, you have fallen away from grace. And here's what Paul's saying. Speaking specifically to these Gentiles who thought they were Christians. And they've tried to be good boys and good girls, and they're trying to blend a little bit of the old with the new, and they think, you know, that they're Christians. And Paul says, look, you've fallen away from what God gave you, which is grace. Grace. You severed yourself from Jesus because you're using the law, the old way, to justify or make yourself right with God. And here's what he means. I mean, imagine today, at the end of the service, just imagine that you came up to Robin and I as we're getting ready to leave, you and your family, and you said, hey, Mark, this church means so much to us, and you have played such an instrumental role in our lives, in our marriage, in our family, and we just want to do something to show our appreciation, to show how grateful we are. And you handed me a $100 gift card. You can put whatever name of restaurant in you want. Okay, but you handed me a $100 gift card. And I looked at that gift card, and I thought, well, that is awfully nice of you, but I can't accept this. I really can't. Let me pay you for it. And you go, no, it's a gift. Key word, it's a gift. Yeah, but I can't take this. It's just too much. Let me give you $75 for it. No, it's a gift. I'm just going to give it to you. It's for you. Well, no. Let me give you $50 for it. No, you can't give me $50 for it. It's a gift. Well, what about $25? And I finally get you at the point of $25 to say, fine, and I give you $25 for the gift card. Guess what? It's no longer a gift. It's now become a discount card. When we add anything to the grace of Jesus, It's no longer a gift. We don't get the gift that Jesus Christ died for. That's the big deal to Paul. That's the intensity in Paul. So here's what Paul's saying. Grace is the hallmark of our Christian faith. Grace is, God, you knew everything about me, and you loved me anyway. Grace is, you don't deserve it, I don't deserve it. You can't deserve it, I can't deserve it. God sent His Son as a gift for you and for me anyway. So you can't go backwards and bring the old to the new and mix it together. And in the moment that you start trying to obey the old way of getting God's acceptance, the moment you try to live up to any of the old law, the moment that you have surgery to get into God's family, that moment you lose, you miss out on the grace that God has given us, the gift He's given. So what Paul is saying is when you adopted any part of the system, you've fallen away from that grace that came from God through Jesus. And that sounds extreme, but you don't understand what a big deal that is. You're missing out on the one thing that now gives you rightness with God, the grace of Jesus. And Paul hasn't even gotten to the most extreme part. Let me keep going. Verse 6, he says, "For in Christ Jesus, neither circumcision nor uncircumcision counts for anything." In other words, Paul says, look, I'm a Jew. I was circumcised on the 8th day like all good Jews, but it doesn't do me any good anymore. That's not why God loves me. And for you Gentiles who are not circumcised, it doesn't matter for you either. All of that is done away with because Jesus brings this brand new thing. And then if you tuned out, tune back in because it's really big. Because what he says next, what Paul says next, is like mind-blowing. In fact, some of you are going to look at me. If I gave you no context for this, you would go, that was heretical. I can't believe he would say that. But if you'll just listen, more will come clear next week. But listen to this. The Apostle Paul, a Pharisee of Pharisees who has memorized the whole Old Testament, he says, look, circumcision, uncircumcision don't count for anything. The only thing that counts or matters is faith working through love. It's all that matters. And we would say, but Paul, look, have you seen this book? Do you know how many laws and rules there are in here? Do you know all the things it says we should and shouldn't do? And Paul says, doesn't matter. It's only faith expressing itself through love. It's only faith. But what about the 10 Commandments over here in Exodus 20? Do any of those count? Paul says, nope, there's only one thing that matters. Love expressed, or faith expressed through love. It's all that counts. In the original language, that word express actually means to work out, to work it out. So the only thing that matters is your faith worked out through love. See, circumcision and all that represents the whole temple model. God, how am I doing? God, how am I doing? And am I being good enough? Am I following the rules? Have I been here enough? Do I get a check for being here today? God, look, I brought my Bible. Do I get extra credit for that? Ooh. All of that is about a vertical relationship. And Jesus comes on the scene and He says, the vertical relationship is taken care of in my grace. And now the way you make sure the vertical relationship stays where it needs to be is you look at your horizontal relationships. You look at how you love people. You look at how you get along with people. You look at how you serve people. It's faith expressed through love. Paul says, you believe Jesus died on the cross for your sin, that God sent Him for that purpose? You're in. You don't have to worry about what God thinks anymore. Because if someone will die for you, they are for you. If someone will lay their life down for you, they are for you. So you don't have to worry about that. You don't have to go to bed at night wondering, how am I with God and how is God with me? Paul says, look, you're fine. The only thing that matters now, the only thing of any value now is how you treat people. Because how you treat people will define where you are in relationship with God. That's a big deal. That's a whole new approach. That is a brand new method, a brand new way. And it's far, far removed from temple thinking. Paul would say it was valuable back then to look at the relationship with God and ask yourself and ask God, are we okay? Are we okay? Are we okay? I'm trying to do the right things. He says, but that way is gone. That's history. Paul goes on, he says, verse 7, he says, you are running well. In other words, when I came and I started this, you were following, you were living in the grace, you were following what I told you. He says, who hindered you from obeying the truth? In other words, who cut in and got in the way? This persuasion is not from him who calls you. In other words, God is not the one who's bringing this message to you through these people. God is not the one. Don't blame him. Don't get to the end and go, well, I tried to blend the old with the new. I tried to blend the old with the new. God didn't institute this. And he says, and something you've probably heard, a little leaven leavens the whole lump. Another way we say that in our culture is that it only takes one apple to spoil the whole bunch. And what Paul says here is that yeast, just a single cell, did you know a fungus? I hope you enjoy your bread as you go out today. Just a single cell of yeast, okay? This fungus can be, a pinch of it can be put into dough, this ooey gooey, what we think is goodness, and the next thing you know, it changes its whole culture. It changes everything about it. So he says, look, a little temple model, a little legalism, a little bit of gracelessness, a little bit of God, are we okay, and how are we doing, and I'm trying to measure up and live up. He says that pollutes it all. It only takes a small dose of the wrong thing to corrupt the whole thing. It only takes a small dose of the wrong thing to corrupt the whole thing. This isn't blend and mix and balance the old with the new. It's a brand new thing. Now, here's Polymotion. This is the big deal, okay? You miss out on Jesus if you start adding in the old way. And Paul is just emphatic. He says, you don't understand what's at stake. Okay? In fact, Paul gets a little R-rated here, okay? You might want to cover your children's ears for just a minute or two. But here's the part that shows just how apoplectic Paul is over this issue of blending the old way with the new way. Paul says in verse 10, he says, I have confidence in the Lord that you will take no other view, and the one who is troubling you will bear the penalty, whoever it is. So Paul says, I'm confident that you're going to follow in the way I've taught you. You're not going to follow these people who've stepped in, cut in, and they're hindering you. And he says, I'm confident they're going to bear the punishment. I wish they would bear the punishment. He goes on in verse 12, he says, I wish those who unsettle you, those who are leading you astray, they would just emasculate themselves. And the word that Paul uses there is apoplectic, which means to cut off. And so what Paul is saying is these people who are teaching you that circumcision is required, if they believe so much in circumcision, I just wish they'd cut the whole thing off. Forget the snip, just cut it all off. Don't worry about it. If they believe in it that much, and we think, but Paul, well, that is apoplectic. That is strong. That is harsh. Okay? That just seems extreme. Paul goes, but you don't see what's at stake. There's so much you don't understand. This is a really, really big deal. Paul knew that because what he had seen and been a part of. That when you use the temple model, do you know what you become? You become self-righteous. Those people and those sacred men, they become self-righteous because they are the ones who can do it and nobody else can do it, and there's no hope for anyone else. And so they tell them, this is what you got to do, this is what you got to do, this is what you got to do to be accepting and pleasing to God, but we know you can't do it anyway, so you're just stuck, and this is the way it is. Okay, and they're self-righteous, but do you know what you become? You become hypocritical because you dumb down the law just enough to make yourself feel good and feel like you're obeying everything, but then you deflect what you're not doing on everybody else. You tell everybody else what's wrong with them and how they need to do it right and what they need to fix in their life. Meanwhile, they're just living however they want to. They're not living up to the standard, to the law. And Paul's seen that time and time and time again. In fact, for some of you, that was your experience. It's not what you, it's one of those things where you went to church and people that you knew were a mess were telling you how messed up you were and what you need to do to get your mess together. That's been many of your experiences. And Paul goes, that doesn't work. God knew it didn't work. So he sent Jesus to give this brand new way. This brand new way has nothing to do with behaving the right way. It has nothing to do with your effort, but everything to do with Jesus dying for you, for your sin on a cross so that you could be right with God. So Paul says when you cling to the old things, you miss the main thing. So stop clinging. He goes on, he says, verse 13, we're almost done. For you were called to freedom, brothers. He uses that word freedom again, I love it. Not to live under law's requirements, not to justify yourself by good behavior, not to become self-righteous or hypocritical, but free from the old way. Only, he says, do not use your freedom as an opportunity for the flesh, but through, here we are again, through love, serve one another. Paul says, look, this isn't freedom to do whatever you please and live however you want. Woohoo, no more rules. I can do whatever I want to do. Paul says it's not about that. Rather, here's how freedom's to look. You serve one another in love. Serve one another in love. Now, here is the amazing thing. I told you, this is not new. It's not new. It's a new way, but it's not new. Because Paul takes us back to the Old Covenant. He takes us back to the Old Testament. And he says, verse 14, for the whole law is fulfilled. In other words, the whole law is done away with. We can put a check mark beside it. You don't have to remember all those rules anymore. The entire Old Testament law is fulfilled in one word. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. And what Paul does is he affirms the Old Testament and the old ways. He says, look, the Jews had it right. My people, the people I'm a part of, we had it right. We had the insight. We had this kernel of truth all along. We just didn't understand it. He says, and now that kernel of truth is being expanded to all generations and all people everywhere. It is the one thing. And the Jewish people, my people, had it all the time. It's love your neighbor as yourself. The rest is just details. You want to know how you are with God? Love your neighbor as yourself. Just go and love, which is exactly what Jesus said. Jesus said, love God, love your neighbor. All the other laws are summed up in these two. In fact, Jesus goes on to teach that the way to love God is by loving your neighbor. And then we've been in John 13, 34, and 35. Jesus tells his disciples, and love one another as I've loved you, love one another. And the world will know that you are my disciples by your love for one another. He calls it his new command. We'll get there next week. Okay? That's what Jesus called us to. See, the temple model says, hey, God, how we doing? God, am I measuring up? Do I get to check off any of this stuff? Have I obeyed the rules? I showed up for church. Look, I was at church all week. I worked in the kids' life. I did renovations. I ran the 5K. I worked the 5K. I'm here on Sunday morning. I'm coming back tonight to bring my bowl of chili, my bowl of soup. By the way, I want to win that, so make sure I win that. But I'm bringing it. I'm doing it. God, do I get credit? It's all about credit. And Paul says the only thing that counts is faith expressing itself through love. And when you get that right, it changes everything. It changes how you see life. It changes how you see the world. It changes how you experience God. It changes your connection to God. Because now you see God in everyone. You see the opportunity to live God before everyone. It changes everything. It will be your religious experience if you'll just treat people, love people as you love yourself. And if this feels strange and it's just too unstructured for me, that's how the Jewish believers felt in the first century. They thought, we just can't go with that. I mean, what if? Look, just use your imagination. What if we could just keep some of the old and add it to the new? And Paul says, no, you cannot do that. That's not grace. You're missing the grace that God has given as a gift through Jesus. So please don't do that. And he means it that intensely and with that much emotion. So here's the question for you and for me this week as we close out. What does love in action look like for you this week? What does loving your neighbor as yourself look like this week? What if every interaction, what if every conversation, what if every temptation, you ask yourself, okay, what does love require of me? What does love require me to do? How am I to love others, love my neighbor in this situation? In this temptation, if I love, it means I don't give in to the temptation because I'm looking out for someone else. I'm not going to be prideful and put that person down. I'm not going to be selfish and get for myself and leave others without. What does love look like for you? What does love require of you? Love means having hard conversations with people you don't want to have conversations with because you know it's going to cost you something, but that's what love does. Love serves, love sacrifices. What does love require of you? So this week, as you approach people, as you engage with people, the question that you have to ask yourself is not, God, how am I doing with you? It's, God, how do I love them? How do I love them? What does love require of me? I'm just telling you, it will change your life. It will change your perspective, and it will change the life of every person you intersect with. Because they will have the opportunity to see grace in action. For see, that's what we're called to simply live out grace, to give grace to other people. So I want to invite you this morning to make a decision today to no longer cling to trying to measure up to God and His standard. I want to invite you to receive the grace that Jesus has for you by acknowledging that you are a sinner, that Christ has died for your sin. He has offered forgiveness to you. It is a free gift for your taking. And I want to invite you to receive that, and from this point forward, to surrender your life to Jesus, and ask yourself the question, what does love require of me? How do I love my neighbor going forward? How do I love my neighbor as myself? If you've never made a decision to put your faith and trust in Jesus and receive that grace, I want you to do that today, and I invite you to do that. It's not a hard thing to do. There's no magical potion for you to drink. Could we make some of that? I'm just kidding. There's nothing like that. It's you having a conversation of acknowledging your sin and receiving the gift. You just had that conversation with God. But if you're uncertain, don't leave here today without letting one of us show you. Let us talk to you. But for the rest of us today, as you go through these doors, as you intersect and interact with other people, here's what you must do. Has just suffered a stroke recently. She can't get out. She can't move around. How do I love that man? How do I love the family up around the street just had a new baby? How do I love my coworkers going through a divorce? How do I love the students that I'm responsible for teaching every day? What does love require of me? Love requires that you love your neighbor as yourself. So do just that. Let's pray. Father, I pray that we grasp this concept. Because there is a world around us who desperately needs to know you. God, they need to know the fullness of you. They need to know the fullness of the grace that you have extended to us through your Son. And God, you are the only one who can do that. God, to break our hearts, reveal, God, all the things in our life that we're holding on to. The ways that we're trying to measure up and become like the kingdom. God, you made it so simple for us. Just simply embrace the grace, the free gift that you offer. And so, Father, my prayer this morning is that you would move and work in a powerful, powerful way. God, that you would drive us to love our neighbor as ourselves, to live out this new command. And God, as we embrace it and live it out, I pray that it would bring life transformation when other people see the grace that we are demonstrating. When they see that, they want to know, where does that come from? And that, God, we can share and impart to them this grace that has been given to us.
God, we ask you all this in the name of Jesus. For it is only